we'd like to go ahead and get started. So let me introduce everybody to Scott Banta, who's on with us tonight talking about tiny house communities and developments. So I'm going to kind of run through the talking points, and then Scott and I will kind of banter back and forth. And if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. So with that, Scott Banta.
Well, Mr. Butler, thank you and welcome all. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about land development. I've been doing land development in Orlando area since 1983. I've probably permitted about 85 major projects. We're just now getting into doing tiny homes. So we started a 501c3 called DreamQuest Tiny Neighborhoods, and we'll be developing new neighborhoods throughout Central Florida, and then we'd ultimately like to go national with it, and also provide consulting services, mainly for social services, because a lot of the social services folks don't know much about developing real estate. So it's kind of an interesting topic, and it's really growing. And so I love the business. I'm almost as old as Robin, but not quite. And I don't think I'll ever stop. So I really enjoy this. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and we'll get going here.
All right. So in the next 30 minutes, what are we going to talk about?
First item here is, what is your dream tiny house community? And in the next slide, we'll have some different things. Where and when do you want to build? And what do you want to build? And then we're going to go through the elements in the process. Every municipality or state or county has a different process. They all have the same type of items, but they're all have slight nuances so it depends on where you are, what state you're in, and what community you're in, what the actual process is going to be. And then we're going to have an overview and then a development outline at the back. In future sessions, we'll be going through the development outline point by point, and basically trying to give you all the information that you would need in order to develop a community. So what is your dream for this? Just small tiny house villages, what they call pocket neighborhoods with clustered homes. That's our goal in our firm right now, is to do pocket neighborhoods where the homes are clustered in a circle. All the front porches face into an amenity area. The amenity area will have fire pits, barbecue grills, picnic tables, a small pavilion, etc. And then the parking will be external to where the homes are clustered. Another type is to do resorts. Airbnb right now is starting to become extremely popular with tiny homes. There's a group that's in Cedar Key, Florida, which is about an hour west of Gainesville. It's right on the Gulf. They have a number of units that are Airbnb. They have both tiny homes on wheels, and they have some container homes. And it's really interesting. The whole resort idea is that particular group's getting anywhere from $129 to $189 a night. And the last time I talked to them, they said they're averaging about 20 to 22 nights a month per unit. When you start to look at those numbers, that's a pretty good return on what may be a $60,000, $80,000 unit in place with amenities considered.
I also concur with that. When we had our tiny house over at near Legoland in an RV park near the airport, it rented out 20 to 22 nights per month. And then also, the hotels is another big deal. I know that there's some people that are building tiny houses, putting them up in the resort areas of Colorado and renting those out in season for $250 and up per night, and they stay full during that time. So, it's just a nomenclature, tiny house hotels or tiny house resorts. It's basically short-term instead of long-term. and you can do it on Airbnb or HomeAway or some of the other sites that are out there that you can advertise on. I have done one. Has anybody, Chris, you've got a development. Have you done anything with RCI,
What's RCI?
Resort Condominiums International?
Oh, no. I did have a tiny home that I rented out on Airbnb and VRBO for a short time before I sold it to a long-term person. But yeah, I could have, here in Durango, I could have been full. Everybody wanted to put in tiny homes and Airbnb them because there's so much money into it. But I really wanted more of a community here. So we decided to not allow short-term rentals in our park so that it was more of a tiny home community. But yeah, there's one up in Lyons, I think, that does really well.
Yeah, yeah. So that's another way to tiny house hotels and resorts. And before we move off of that, I'll tell you that we did take our RV park and sign a contract with RCI. And, you know, we haven't had anybody from RCI stay at, it's just a fish camp that we have. But for a 2-bedroom, 2-bath tiny home, which was really just a 13 by 30 park models, I think is what it amounted to. They gave us 1,774,000 points if we were to give them the whole thing. But I gave them 4 weeks. They gave us 120,000 points. And so Bonnie and I use those when we travel, you know, for a week, you know, it might be 10,000 points, might be 20,000 points, and an exchange fee of $230. But to stay in a resort for $230 was really cheap. But that's another thing that RCI, if you guys are thinking, I'm just throwing that out there. And I know, Scott, this is probably new to you, but you know, RCI is looking for outdoor resorts. And if you want to develop something like that into a timeshare, it's a whole another business, the timeshare industry and the timeshare business. But that's a definite possibility with tiny houses as popular as they are now.
It'd be interesting to sell the tiny houses on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
Like the timeshares, or you know, even just a fair share type thing, you know, 6 times a year or whatever.
Yeah, well, what our plan was, we were selling points. You can sell 10,000 points. We were selling them for $4,000. And so you can divide up, you know, 4 weeks into 120,000 points at 10,000 a piece. That's 12 times 4. That's $48,000 for 1 week. And then you charge a maintenance fee. We were charging $99, you know, per year maintenance fee, and it wasn't mandatory, but it was just a membership fee, really. So you multiply that times however many you have. I mean, it's really a cash cow when you think about it. If you're into the into that timeshare type of industry, but it does cost a lot of money I mean, half of your money that you get has to go into marketing and getting people in and selling them the timeshare. So you might make a bundle on your sale of your tiny house, but half of it's going to go to marketing.
You have to be really careful if you're going to do that relative to the cash flow, because a lot of times the people put a low amount down, and then you're paying out your 42 to 50% in the marketing costs. So you're upside down cost-wise from a cash flow basis real quickly.
Yeah, you got to be careful.
It takes a long time for that to catch up. David Siegel, the guy that started Westgate, had a number of places, and he almost cratered, and he finally went down into that way bottom, and he hit that bottom, and then when it went up, it was like a rocket ship going up for what they were making. So that's an interesting financial model to do that.
I got a
So
question, if you don't
Excuse me?
mind. I got a question, if you don't mind. I sit on our planning board here, and one of the things that we had a discussion about on the Airbnbs and that was the meals and rooms tax. Like I don't know about elsewhere, but in New Hampshire, if you don't pay it, they'll fine you, and they really come down on you hard. And any time that you become you do Airbnb, at least for us in New Hampshire, you become a commercial property. So it changes the use of your home too. So, I mean, it sounds like you'd even have to go before the planning board and the zoning board to get all that approved before you even did it. I mean, you could be subject to that. How,
Well,
how do you see that in
Well-
other places?
what we did, and who was this that was talking? Was that Doug?
That's Doug. Yep.
Oh, yeah. Doug, what in here in the state of Florida, they have the same thing. But Bonnie, do you know what that tax is that we pay on our short-term rentals?
We
I'd
have-
honestly have to go look it up.
It's
For,
like
for us,
10% or-
it's the resort tax, and I'm here right almost next to, just north of Orlando. So we have the resort tax. Any of the short-term rental that's under 7 months technically is subject to the resort tax. The other thing that's happening, a lot of communities have been targeting people on Airbnb, and they actually are hiring people to go check on what units are rented in order to bill out that resort tax. So, they'll pose as a renter to find out whether or not that unit's actually being used as an Airbnb. So, and then in many instances, I have a friend who's developing an RV park in the low hill country of Texas, and they have like no zoning, no anything. And the city told him that he should probably have paved roads if he's, having multiple $100,000 worth of RVs running on it. Here, we can't even look at the property without getting a permit in Central Florida. So I think that's all predicated on where you are. And I guess that was Doug talking at New Hampshire. That sounds fairly similar to us. We have to have surveys and topos and tree surveys and environmental and all. We have a lot of process to go through here to permit almost anything.
And that's why it's nice to know what all the details are in Florida, a high regulated area. And then at least when you go to your area and it's maybe less regulated, you won't need all the things that we're going to be talking about here in the next few weeks, but it's good to know what they are. And in our park, it was an existing RV park. So we really didn't have to do anything other than this was a new unit. We had to get a permit for it. They came out and inspected it. And then I think we didn't have to fill anything out. We just had to start paying the tax. I think that's how we started paying it. It wasn't like crazy hard, is what I'm trying to say, in order to make that happen. We had 2 glamping tents, and we had this unit that we rented on short term, and then we had a tiny house and 2 tiny houses that we rented out long term in that park. And we only had to pay short-term rental tax or hospitality tax, or whatever you want to call it, on the 2 glamping tents and the tiny house, the 2-bedroom, 2-bath. So moving right along, what's next, Scott?
We have the larger residential neighborhoods, which we would typically get into a platting situation there. And in Florida, in many areas, you have to go through a lot of permitting here, where you go through civil engineering. We have retention areas, which are water collection areas for stormwater here in Florida, et cetera. And then you would have to plan out your streets and then cut your lots out, et cetera. A lot of the tiny home processes that we're seeing now are being built on what we call scattered lots in neighborhoods. For example, there's a group that's very active in Detroit, and they're taking existing lots and putting tiny homes on existing lots on existing streets. And what's nice about that is most of that already has some sort of stormwater management in place. And then they also have, usually have public utilities available. So it's just a matter of connecting up to the public utilities.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna see more larger residential neighborhoods. We talked briefly last week about the big one in Texas.
Yeah, and
And
the in the larger residential neighborhoods, it's the people don't want a tiny house beside a McMansion. So, the fact that, hey, we can create some neighborhoods just for tiny houses that are going to be lived in, not like an Airbnb type thing, but basically lived in full time, I think is what that's looking at.
And hey,
And
Robin, I joined a little late. I don't know if you guys talked about it or not, but have you talked about cluster developments?
we did, right now,
Okay.
we're actually just kind of going over the different types. We're going to go deeper into the cluster homes and the cluster developments in the pocket neighborhoods on another session. But right now, we're just trying to go over from 20,000 feet, we're kind of looking at this whole thing. And then we're going to drill down a little bit deeper, on the subsequent sessions.
Our particular emphasis for the company that I'm working with and part of is pocket neighborhoods and cluster homes. So maybe next week we'll get into that further. We talked a little bit about it last week. I showed one of the site plans, a couple of site plans of some of the properties we're looking at relative to doing the cluster. We find it's interesting here that we can get about 10 units per acre with our homes that are 18 feet wide, because you have to have fire separation between the units. But we're finding our density can get up to right in the neighborhood of 10 units per acre, which is really pretty good in terms of ameliorating your land prices.
Yeah, and the one we talked about last week, which was Terry Lanthrop's Lake Dallas, Texas, he had 1 acre parcel with a house, an existing home on it. He put 8 foot wide units on there, and he put 13 of them there. Got that approval on that 1 acre, and that didn't include the house itself, and there was an outbuilding of some kind on that. So, and then the next, and we already talked about this a little bit. There's full-time or short-term. These are when you're dreaming or coming up with your plan or your vision for what a tiny house community looks like. These are some considerations that basically you want to look at. So there's full-time or short-time, whether you're going to rent it, this is interesting, whether you're going to rent just the tiny house or just the lot, or you're going to rent both, because you can do all three when you're planning your development. You want to talk a little bit about that, Scott?
We have a community here on a lake that has a small amount of lakefront, and you own your own home, but you rent the lot, and the lot rents run anywhere from $550 a month up to about $1,200-1,300 for the half a dozen that they have that are on the lake. And then there's some that have different views, and you can do that. So it's almost like owning either an RV resort type or a mobile home park, where the residents own their own unit, but they have a lot rent. And that's kind of a neat program for investors, because you don't really have to do anything. And then you also have the thing whether or not they're permanently tied down, or they're people pull them in and out of the park. Like both Robin and I know a gal that there's a little park in Leesburg, Florida, and she travels all over the place, goes to a lot of the shows, and she brings her house. And she built it about 10 or 15 years ago and built it herself. And it's a neat little thing, but she's always taking her house in and out of the park. Whereas the little park that I was talking about in Orlando, they're basically permanently attached, and then they have skirting almost like a mobile home, et cetera. So you don't see those moving anywhere very often.
Yeah, and then there's the possibility of doing both. In other words, you own the property, own the tiny house, and you rent out both of them, or and that kind of a thing. And if I can get Eric on, Eric is doing something interesting in Atlanta. He's on his 3rd subdivision of about 3 acres. Each subdivision, each plot is about 3 acres. He's getting, I think he said 39 houses on 3 acres, which is really good, good density there. But he's got permits for what they call detached condos. So it's a condo where there's an HOA and all that, and these units are detached condos where he sells the unit, but he owns the land. So we'll try to get him on one of these calls to talk about that project too. What about selling the lots, developing and then selling off the lots? How does that's another way to do this, right?
Yeah, that particularly would be almost like buying a normal house in a subdivision, let's say from a DR Horton, or even just a resale. So, you put the like what they're doing in Detroit, they're renting those units, but they could sell them and provide affordable housing for the missing middle, or, you know, for whatever section of affordable housing you want to get into. That's all. We talked a little bit about that briefly last week, about all the different levels of affordability in terms of income levels, et cetera. So the for sale on lots, that we're going to be basically doing that, although we're going to have it's going to be like a condo on ours, where the ground will all be common, but you'll own your own unit, almost like a condo.
Well, there you go. That's what Eric's is doing too. And then there's also the possibility of developing the lots and then selling the lots with the utility hookup, you know, kind of like what they call a microgrid, where you have a pedestal and the water and the sewer, and they can pull their tiny house in. And I mean, there's a Yogi Bear campground, 3000 Clarkona Road in
Cully.
is that in Coy? Yeah, where
Yeah.
they basically just took this campground and subdivided the lots, sold them off, and all the utility hookups and everything are right there. So
The nice thing about that too, if you're just playing the investor game, is you can have those people put all their lots into a pool, kind of like they do with you know, studio efficiency condos at the beach, where you have maybe a 50-unit condo building, and everybody puts them in the pool, and then they rent the units out for the weekends, or, you know, when various events happen like Labor Day and Memorial Day, et cetera. So that's kind of a neat thing too. So you can generate, if you bought the lot, you could generate income when you were not using the lot yourself.
and the park manages that, or
Right.
the
You
property
just pay a
manager
management fee to
handles all
somebody,
that.
yeah.
Oh, okay, that's cool. All right, let's go on to the next slide. You want to talk about this one here?
Yeah, obviously, the whole thing of any type of tiny home community is going to be based on your location and what is the driving factor that brings you there. For us, in looking at our clustered pocket neighborhood type things, what we're looking at is hitting the missing middle, which it's been sort of defined as those people that make 80 to 120% of median income. And the median income varies dramatically. And we had a slide on that last week. And if you send Leanna a note, she can send you that slide. But so we're here in Orlando. So we have Universal, we have Disney. Robin mentioned Legoland, which is a town about 45 minutes southwest of Orlando. And then, so we have SeaWorld. So we have a lot of amenities here. We're also only an hour basically from the ocean, and a lot of areas in Florida aren't that far from water. So that would have a tendency to be more resort oriented. Our little place is close to Stetson University, the first one we're looking at. So we may end up with some students in there. One of the nice things about the clustering that we find in the pocket neighborhood versus maybe a street design layout like a normal neighborhood is that we're promoting the social connectivity. So we're looking for permanent residents, and we're going to be selling our units. So what happens in that case is we need to be more concerned about what we're close to. So we have here the distance from the city, tourist attractions, employment centers, or just work. Public transportation is usually important. Public utilities, in order to get your density, most of the time, you're going to need to be on public water and sewer. And then you want to be close to shopping, churches, schools, et cetera. A lot of the people that are going to live in tiny home neighborhoods may not have cars. So you're going to want to be close to public transportation or have access to it. Our public bus system here is called Lynx, L-Y-N-X, and Lynx will let people have vans to carpool, if you will. So they'll put in a neighborhood, maybe a van that has somebody that goes and collects 5 or 6 other people and drives to a work center or something like that, and then they have it available to go shopping, et cetera. So those are all kind of interesting things. So you want to look at your location. Is there something specifically driving it? I was on a panel for Volusia County, which is the county for where Daytona is, Daytona Beach, and we went through all these different factors. And one of the things that happens if you start getting too far out, like boonified, if you will, then you don't have the public utilities, you don't have the transportation, you're not close to the work centers, and the ultimate success of that project may hinge on how you fit into the location there. Now, it may be okay if you're trying to do a remote thing and people are coming in for, let's say, church retreat weekends or any of those kind of things, or some sort of a retreat, that would be okay to be more remote. But a lot of times they're going to want these to be on properties that are close to these things that we say the distance from here.
Yeah, and let me on Monday we had V on here, and he in Williston went into the city, the town of Williston, on a lot. It was about an acre lot, and put 12 Airbnb tiny houses on, and a coffee shop, commercial coffee shop called the Sad Donkey. And there's a pavilion there, and he says that he's had it for, I don't know, how long has he been? A couple of years, hasn't it been, Bonnie, that he's had that development there? And so that's another idea. Just go into a little town, neighboring rural town type like Williston. And the reason why he did this was there wasn't a hotel in the town. And so he said, well, I'm going to put these tiny houses in. And it was before COVID. I know that he got this thing opened up, and he's just stayed full the whole time. So if you want to get Mondays, we're going to figure out how we can get you guys the recordings of these that we're doing. But if you want to see Mondays, he talks about that, and also a shopping center. They bought a Winn-Dixie, old Winn-Dixie shopping center, and it had like the roof over a portion of it, but it didn't have the walls on two sides of it or something. And he's putting commercial retail 10 by 20s in there, commercial retail units, tiny houses on wheels. And so it's just that was an interesting talk we had with him. He showed us around the shop and everything, just to put a plug in for V and their company. Kevin, I think, is the other guy that we're involved with there. But anyway,
the other thing one of the things that happens in Williston, just to add to Williston, it's only 14 miles away from the World Equestrian Center, and it's about 8 miles away from HIPS, which is Horses in the Sun. And the horses there's a huge, and Williston is just over a county line between Marion County and Levi County. And Marion County is not very happy with any of these type of operations. They're getting away from approving any mobile home parks, RV parks, and they haven't decided what they like on tiny homes or not. Levi County is just one of those counties that says, bring it on and let's see if we can figure out how to make it work, and which is kind of interesting. So, but again, they're close to some huge horse amenities in that part of the country.
Absolutely. And that's
some
good.
Of you may have ski areas like Robin mentioned about Colorado, or just vacation places, where people can go, let's say maybe an hour outside of Atlanta or an hour outside of Orlando, and go and spend a week and just be kind of laid back, and they like the idea of the tiny living.
Yeah, and then there's the Getaway. If you guys Google Getaway, if you haven't already, it's an interesting. They're building small, less than 20 lineal feet units, and putting them in getaway places, out remote areas. And you have to put your cell phone in a box, and they give you a s'mores kit and a fire starter kit. And they want you to have a weekend experience where you start a fire, make some s'mores. You wake up, they have a big window looking out at nature, and you don't see anything else. So when you wake up, you look at nature. So that's another company that's doing fantastic on developing using tiny houses on wheels. It's called Getaway. They're all over the US with those. All right, let's move on. Is that all on that slide we need to talk about, Scott?
Yeah, I think I've
All right. And so, yeah, these are all different types of tiny houses. We just needed to touch base on those so we know what we're talking about when we're talking. There's tiny houses on wheels. There's tiny houses on foundation. There's a big thing on container homes. We even see some yurts popping up. I know John and Finn have some yurts on their property. There's glamping tents. We had 2 glamping tents on our property. And so there's all different types that you can do either Airbnb or full-time habitation on. Do you want to talk about your foundation cluster homes a little bit? You're doing yours on foundation, right? What size?
We're
and
doing
how many-
we're doing ours on foundations, and our houses range from 396 to 568 square feet, depending on the thing. And we're most likely going to build them out of steel frame now. We were originally going to do them on concrete, but I think we're going to go to steel frame. Here we have wind regulations that we have to live with, so we're going to make them 200-mile-an-hour wind rated, because we just had a hurricane come through and there was a lot of devastation here. So we want to make sure that they'll stand up, and then we're going to use metal roofs. So that's one section. We're also looking at, that's our 501c3. I personally am looking at building tiny homes on wheels and doing Airbnb. And I think there's a lot of areas. My wife and I have been going up in August every year up to the Blue Ridge Parkway and Skyline Drive last year. And there's a lot of exits, and there are a few exits, I'm sorry. And then there's property by the exits and there's very few places to stay when you're on the Blue Ridge Parkway, for example. You can stay at either end or Asheville. There's a couple places here and there. But it would be a neat place to go set up about a 50-unit Airbnb tiny home community where you could nestle it in the nature a little bit. There's a small tiny home community built on the side of a mountain in Sedona, Arizona, for example. But it's not very organized. So our whole thing is, I'd like to make it all organized, landscape the hell out of it, make it someplace where you really want to go, and people are going to tell all their friends about it. The company that I mentioned earlier at Cedar Key, they have some container homes. And the neat thing about the container homes, in my personal opinion, is you can buy a container very inexpensively. And if you're real handy with a torch and some welding rods, I think you can put some neat. I've seen some of the pictures of these things are phenomenal as far as I'm concerned. And then you
Really
can also
creative,
achieve
yeah.
you can achieve a fairly high density also with those. And Robin mentioned he got a buddy has 13. We're getting 10. So in terms of that, those are some pretty good numbers. For us, a medium density project is around 10 on all the zoning. So we can sometimes fit into a multifamily medium density zoning with our tiny homes.
Cool.
The note at
And-
the bottom is the $100,000 project takes as much work and follows the same procedure as a 10 million. The best example I can give you of that is the big institutional investors with the apartment complexes. Most of them won't touch anything under 250, 280 units, and most of them want 300-ish plus units. And it takes the same amount of work to put together a 150-unit apartment complex as it does a 300-unit one. Same thing happens in the tiny homes. So our original goal was to try to do 20 to 30 units. And now we're finding that with amenities and entranceways and all these different things, that probably 30 to 70 is a better number when we're really going through it. Our first little project's 22, but we're now looking at larger projects so that we can, because when I do the engineering, I can engineer 22 homes and for the same amount as I can engineer 55 or 60 homes. But when I put an entry in, for example, the entry might cost me 30 grand and it's divided by 22 or it's divided by 60. So there's a huge economies of scale on some portions of the development. That's another consideration. But also you have to look at your market to figure out whether or not it would support 60 or 70 or however many units. And again, whether you're selling them or renting them.
Yeah, and it's just another zero or a couple more zeros at the back of it, guys. And like Scott said, you and I, when we're doing developments, we don't have the pocket cash to fund it. So we'll get into a little bit later how to get angel investors or investors involved, private money investors in the initial stages of it, and then once you get past a certain stage, it's all kind of gravy from there. But anyway, that's something on another day. But just don't want to just wanted to raise when we're dreaming, we're having a dream session today. When you're dreaming, it's the same amount of work, whether you do a 100,000 or a 10 million or $100 million project. So
some of the things, going back to the types here, our houses on foundations are going to cost considerably more than a tiny house on wheels. But the tiny house on wheels is limited to 8'6" wide, outside, and 13'6" high. When I put my house on the foundation, we can go, typically in multiples of 2 because of the truss, layout, et cetera. We have 2 feet required between them. But so we kind of build it into that type of thing, but you can get more tiny houses on wheels because of the size of them than we could on foundations. So you might be able to get up to 15 or more with the tiny homes on wheels.
And you
So
can go
that's-
wider than 8'6" wide. You just need a special use permit when you move it. So we've seen some 10 and some 12-foot wide tiny homes, but you're right.
I
And
was
then-
going to say, we've got
I meant-
those on ours. We've got 10 and 12 up to 15 footers in our tiny home park, but they do take a much more to move them.
yeah,
I just meant I know that, but I just meant generally. You see most of the ones on wheels are 8'6" wide.
yeah, a lot of them are. And the point that you're trying to make is a good point. In other words, you can get more per, and if you're talking density, if it's only, say you limit people bringing them into 8'6" wide, you design the lots for that, then you could get more units per acre by doing that. Chris, I got a question for you. Are yours single wides, or that's pretty wide when you get into, what did you say, 14 feet?
15 feet. The park models coming out of Texas are 15 feet. They're like 30 by 15, I believe. So we've got one of those here. Yeah, and then there's a company just north of us building them up to 12 feet wide. Generally, people seem to want that little extra width and don't mind. At least in Colorado, you just have to have the wide load sign, to move it.
Right. Good point, guys. Yeah, when we do the 8'6", what we're saying is that's the maximum, that width that you can put on a road, 8'6" by 13'6" high, without a special use permit in order to move it. So you could take your pickup truck basically and move your tiny house. But if you need that extra elbow room, why not make it 10 feet wide or 12 feet wide? It makes a huge difference in the in this space on the inside of the tiny house.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
So when you get into your 8'6" wide ones, you always have to be a little concerned about where everybody's going to park, because an awful lot of people, especially if it's a couple or a couple with a young child or whatever, a lot of them have 2 cars. So you have to kind of consider where you're going to put the parking. We're working on a ratio of about 1.7 to 1. We seemingly are able to get that through most local governments because of the nature of the housing.
What does that mean? 1.7 to 1, 1.7 spaces?
Spaces, yeah.
Okay.
And that little park that we were mentioning in Orlando has kind of a parking problem sometimes. So
Yeah.
they don't really have extra areas to park. So, if you have, 3 other couples coming into your tiny home for a, football game or a cookout or something like that, those are the kind of things you have to consider when you're developing a community. You need to make sure that there's additional parking areas for guests, et cetera, and that they're not too far away.
Right. Yeah. And you either like yours are all clustered together and the parking's on the outside, or you could have it where basically you have one or two spaces at each home. Is another way to do that, right, Scott?
Yes. Uh-huh.
What about
And then,
pedestrians?
but if you're doing, let's say, a typical neighborhood design where you have lots and the homes are on lots and you've got, the lots are facing each other on a street, most places, not all, but a lot of places are going to require that you put in sidewalks. Ours, we're doing interior, basically sidewalks connecting out to the external parking areas. But in terms of the pedestrians, you want to think of dog walks. You want to think of how to get to your amenities, how that's going to work if you have any amenities, and just a general kind of traffic flow for pedestrians is always kind of interesting. Ours, we're going to have a circular walkway that connects to each unit and then connects into our central amenity with the fire pits and the barbecue grills and all of that.
And then some people are putting in, I know, what they call bike paths with permeable material. So, in some places you can only have so much impervious space. And if instead of roadways and walkways, if you're putting bike paths in with permeable material, people can still walk on them and get around. But the local authorities will allow it because it is permeable and you can get more density in your units when you do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways around that. There's also, we have retention. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're doing what they call low impact development and green stormwater management. So we have in every project that we're going to do here in Florida anyway, we have to have retention. And in some instances, we're going to use what they call exfiltration trenches, which are pipes that are underneath the parking lot, so that the parking lot will have pervious surface so that the water will go through the pavement and go into these trenches, and the trenches will hold the water. And instead of, let's say, having a pond where the water would go into the pond, that saves us a lot of space also.
Good point.
One of the things you need to look at is fire protection and security, because we have our homes in a circle, interior and outside of the parking. You can't drive the fire truck up to, a typical street home where, they can drive up. So we have to have a minimum separation of 10 feet between houses, but we also have to be able to get into the front and the back of the houses. So that means that we have to have a stabilized grass area that would hold the weight of the fire truck. We have a couple of openings in our parking lot so that the fire trucks can actually get into the interior circle in case there's a problem.
Good point. Are you fenced in too?
Yeah, we're going to be fenced on all sides, except for we will not be gated, but we'll have probably 6-foot PVC fences around 3 sides, and then the street side we'll use an open picket, like wrought iron type fencing.
And then as far as security cameras or security guards, or what kind of security do you?
No guards, but we'll have a lot of cameras around.
Okay.
You'll also want to have probably fire smoke detectors in all your units.
Oh yeah, definitely.
We're getting hardwired smoke detectors in most of Florida now. It's becoming for foundation built properties.
Well, even the tiny houses, NOAA requires that in our NOAA Plus standard, hardwired smoke detectors in all sleeping areas. All right, what about roads? You talked a little bit about the difference in the parking, but you were talking about, do we have to have roads in these subdivisions? Can we use other material other than asphalt? Talk a little bit about that, or is it just something to consider?
That's going to be locationally determined as far as I can tell. I mentioned my friend who's doing the project in Texas. Their building department said it might be nice to have paved roads. So, I mean, they don't really need to do anything. his is gonna be pretty a higher end RV type resort. He's not really doing tiny homes yet, although we're starting to talk about it. But I'm also consulting on a project that's we're converting a 34 unit mobile home park into a 67 unit RV park. So some of the things to consider: if you have one-way roads, they can be narrower than two-way roads. And then you have to figure out how your unit's going to go into its space, and how to get that unit into the space, and if it's going to be more permanent or transitory, where they're going to pull the unit out. Maybe somebody's coming in and they're staying for 2 or 3 months and then they leave. So typically here we have a road base, and then on top of it some sort of pavement or whatever, and there's all different kinds that you can do for that. There's what we briefly mentioned, the pervious pavement. So when you get into areas that have high impervious ratios, where maybe you can't impact more than 35% of your lot or 35% of your site or whatever, you start to have to look at potentially some alternative pavement designs. But in all cases, you usually have to have some kind of road base under it. Here in Florida, we have to be 2 feet. The bottom of our road has to be more than 2 feet above the high water table for all new construction. And then usually a two-way road is 22 feet wide, and then your base would extend. And if you have curbing, here we have 50-foot roads, 50-foot wide right-of-ways require managed stormwater. So we'd have drainage features like manholes, et cetera, that would pop off. The water would run into those, and then they would go into a pond or whatever. If you go to wider and you don't want to have the controlled stormwater, and you're going to use swales, let's say, for the side of your road, we can go to 60-foot right of way and then put swales there where it doesn't require the curbing and the piping. The 50 foot is going to require curbing and piping. And when you start to think about that, if I have a lineal foot, 1 lineal foot of a Miami curb or a stand-up, they call it F curb here, it's going to run me probably about $15-ish per lineal foot. So if I have to do that on both sides of a road, that's just a pretty heavy cost. A friend of mine's doing an RV park up in the Florida Panhandle, and he's able to do the swales in 50 feet. He doesn't have to do the swales in 60 feet like we have to do here. So the road consideration is something you probably want to look into if you're going to do any type of community development, because that's a big number. The roads are a big number. And then whether or not you're doing a paved pad or just a grass pad. And then what's the size of your pad? I'm not sure what Chris did on his up in Durango, but for the pad, if they provided a pad or not for the homes.
You want to weigh in on that, Chris?
Yeah, we did a gravel pad. The regulations here where we just had to do a gravel road with the swales. It was a 30-foot road, and then we did gravel pads. We have bigger lots here because we had to go through as a mobile home park because the county didn't have any stuff for tiny home parks. And so, yeah, we had some restrictions because of that as far as parking and stuff. I would have loved to do a development like yours where we had the parking away from the homes in a central area. But because of the regs here, we're stuck with the typical mobile home rectangular lots, 2 parking spaces in front, and they wouldn't deviate on that for us. So
gotcha. Yeah. So that's again a locational factor. So that, if you're thinking about doing it, what I've always found the best thing to do, and I've done a lot of them. This whole side of my head's flat from banging against the brick wall of government, but is to go in and have some kind of a sketch. It doesn't have to be real fancy of what you're going to try to do. And most planning people, if you go in and show them kind of the respect that you would show a police officer when they stop you for speeding or whatever, if you can show them that type of respect and not be adversarial to them, because they're going to tell you a bunch of bullshit that is adversarial to what you want to do usually. And then, so you kind of have to work through it. I look at it, even my business card is a jigsaw puzzle. So if you've ever done a jigsaw puzzle, usually, let's say it's 100 piece. So you get the four corners, and then you typically do the edges. And then there's a red barn in there and a bunch of yellow flowers out in front of it. So you do the red barn, and then if you get a 1,000 piece puzzle and it's got a big sky thing in it, you're doing the blue forever. But if you can break it down into the smaller pieces like the yellow flowers and the red barn, et cetera, it seems to make the puzzle work better. And then no matter what happens, there's a couple things that we always just figure. One is there's that one piece that you put in and you just know it's going to fit right in that spot, and it doesn't fit there. And you put it back out, and if you're like me, a half an hour later, again, you're going to pick up that piece and try to put it back in that spot, and it ain't going to fit. It just doesn't fit there. And then you get toward the end of the puzzle, and then you find another piece that actually fits in there, and it doesn't look like anything like you would have thought that would fit in that spot. And so that lets you complete your puzzle. And that's typically what happens in development. We can be rolling along, and then they throw something at you that is just the strangest thing in the world, and you have to deal with it. You have to figure out to keep your cool and to go ahead and do that so you complete your puzzle. It's kind of fun. And then you always got to figure it's going to take longer and cost a bit more than you thought.
Well, hopefully
you think you can get it done in 8 months for 80 grand, it's going to be 12 months at 110 grand or whatever.
Yeah, hopefully when we get in.
Chris, did you find that?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, we found, working with the planners, we have a small planning department, and they just weren't willing to bend at all. They were stuck, black and white. This is the way it is. So, we did have to make some compromises, and it worked out in the long run. But yeah, definitely everything. I mean, I'm glad we started the process 3 years ago. It took a full 2 years to really get through planning. It was just a long process. And then, another year of completion, which was, things were a little bit over budget, but not as bad as they would have been had we done it this last year. So, yeah.
There's a couple things that that I do. It depends again on where I'm going. I did a project in St. Johns County, which is St. Augustine, Florida. And it was in the county, and the county is notoriously hard. So we hired the local engineer, and we hired a local land use attorney that was buddies with all the commissioners. It still took us an extraordinarily long time, but we probably cut about a third of the time off of what it would have cost, because when your engineer goes in our case, we have to have a lot of engineering in order to get a subdivision approved of any type. And so when the engineer goes in, he can talk about 5 projects with the people at the county at the same time. And so if you try to bring your Orlando guy into St. Augustine, they just wipe them out. It's just, and vice versa. Same thing with attorneys. You want the good old boy. I had a time one time when I worked for a big company, and they flew their attorney in from Chicago. And this is in Vero Beach, Florida. And our attorney comes in, he's got corduroy pants on with little ducks on his pants. And this Chicago attorney's cranking out all these documents and handing them to our attorney with the ducks on his pants. And he briefly glances at it, and he puts it down. And we're all just talking, and another document comes in. And this guy's got the 3-piece suit on it, and our attorney's with the corduroy pants and a polo shirt. And finally, the attorney from Chicago, the big guy, said, how come you just, and he said, it's my court, my judge.
Yeah. And well, guys, we're going to have to kind of wrap through this pretty quick here. We already talked about utilities and water and sewer. We touched on that. Stormwater management and permeable area. What about waste disposal, Scott?
Depends on where you are. Waste disposal, most often when you get into any kind of a park situation, here at least it's going to be a dumpster with a private company. Typically, in ours, we will not have, normal street pickup. Where my house is, I have a normal street situation. We, twice a week we roll our garbage cans out, and they pick it up, and we put the empty ones back in the garage. So most of these cases, if you're going to do it, most of the cases of a park, you're going to have some sort of dumpster arrangement with a private service company.
All right. And then the environmental element, we kind of talked about that last time, the trees and the sensitive areas. That's another consideration. We can kind of develop that a little bit later on, but when we're talking about, what we need to do, that's another environmental element is the trees and especially we talked about, where there's water, low-lying areas, especially here in Florida, we have a lot of environmentally sensitive areas or with endangered species and things like that. But
and
guys,
some of the mountain areas too. Also, you have the hillside, which is probably should be considered. We probably should add that to our slide here, because when you start getting into high topography, then a lot of things change dramatically. All your foundations and all the dirt roads, a lot of stuff has to change. So
yeah,
anyway.
Absolutely. All right, well, guys, any questions that we need to handle before I think we kind of handled them along the way. If not, then I'm going to say thank you to all and good night, and we'll see you or good day, wherever you might be. And we will see you tomorrow for the inspectors. And Chris, do you have anything that you needed to chat about, or are we kind of good here?
Oh, no, I just wanted to thank you guys for doing this. It's really interesting and informative, even for someone who's done it once and maybe looking to do another development. It's all the different ways to do it, and brainstorming has been real good for me.
All
All right, thanks.
We'll tell your friends about it. All right, guys. We'll take it from here. Good night.
And good luck, everybody. Thank you.